Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to the Technosemiotics session again. Today we have in the seminar Marie-Theres Fester-Seeger, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Europa-Universität Viadrina in Frankfurt-Oder. And well, I know Therese from our Lithme EU cost project, basically, the network that converges around the idea of language in the human machine era and trying to map out all the future possibilities from there. But Therese, for her PhD, she studied this concept of languaging or presencing, or like the idea how we evoke people basically when they're not there. As far as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong.
It was a bit complicated, yeah.
Yeah, and she has dabbled in biosemiotics a little bit, but yeah, other than that, she mostly shares like this cognitive approach, or like how to say, like this embodied cognition, or like really language as something beyond mere grammar and words, and beyond what traditional linguistics or structural linguistics conceptualizes language as. And as such, it's a really interesting perspective for the context of AI, where, you know, suddenly we discover that it's not so simple to, you know, take what we thought was language and then put it in a machine, and then the outcomes sort of like sometimes they work, but sometimes they really fail in spectacular ways. So yeah, I'm really interested in hearing what the languaging perspective brings into this mix. And yeah, Therese is going to tell us about why we do not communicate with machines.
Yeah.
So yeah, I give the floor to you.
Okay, thank you, Auli. About the biosemiotics mention, I always felt biosemiotics was beyond me, so I wouldn't even call it double into it. I mean, still try to make sense out of it. But other than that, yeah, I'll just start. We'll speak into the void now, I guess. So I'll just have one picture up here on my screen. So I was very, I don't know, perhaps I was brave, I don't know, with my title. So let's see whether it actually works out. I also have to say I'm a bit nervous, because what I'm doing is I'm currently thinking about these things. So you've kind of caught me in my current thinking process, and this presentation kind of helps me with that. So please bear with me, it's way too long. If you have questions, I mean, usually we should take them towards the end, but it's gotten kind of out of hand. So you can also ask in between, or if you have comments, I don't mind. And so, as I said, maybe it was a bit too straightforward to say we do not communicate with machines, but I would like to discuss this with you, whether you think what we do with machines is communication or not. So Auli already did this nice introduction, so I do not have to introduce myself. My name is Therese, and that's all, because it's quite brief. Anyway, so because my presentation is long, I'd rather say in the beginning what I want to say towards the end, where I want to get to. So as Auli already said, I come from a perspective that sees language as human activity. So language is not a code and should not be seen as a code, but actually as something that people do. And it emerges through our bodily dialogical coordination. So when we engage with others and how we coordinate with others, but also our coordination with aspects in and with our environment. So what I want to say actually is that we really do not communicate with machines, whatever communication might be, but rather I want to show is that we coordinate with the conception of language in these machines, like with the conception of language in these machines. So let's see whether that thinking process kind of works out in this presentation. So how's my talk structured? So first of all, kind of want to ask myself in a way, what is actually communication? There are different perceptions of what it could be. Then I have to say, I want to look at how language is conceived of in large language models, for example, or speech-enabled AI. And here my mathematical understanding kind of fails me. So please bear with me that I show you a simple version of how I understand language is understood in large language models or used. Then I turn to the languaging perspective, a few key insights from the literature. And then what I present is my idea of how we can approach languaging and artificial intelligence, and then draw my conclusion. All right. I hope I won't be too fast. So what is communication? That is a question I'm actually asking myself a lot, because it's a term everyone uses, and then I wonder what it actually means. The old communication models are about a transfer of meaning and often refer to a verbal form. So we have a verbal, or words or signals are transferred from a sender to a receiver. We have these old information technology-based models from Shannon and Weaver, for example, that everyone knows. Here I used a model from Ellistrom from 2018 because I wanted to know, so what's the current thinking in a way? And he highlights that communication through media also includes a transfer of something. It occurs between two different places of what here he calls in this model a producer's mind and a perceiver's mind. And here the medium engages as an intermediate stage that makes a transfer possible. So he wanted to kind of go around the idea that we only rely on what we say, so on the verbal, but also that our body and other aspects of language play a part when we communicate. So what he did, he talked about a producer's mind and a perceiver's mind and cognitive import, which should resemble ideas and thoughts, etc. And so he places communication in a person's mind. Well, while he shows that the producer and the perceiver and the media all impact each other and there's no unidirectionality, my problem is a little bit with the mind. That again, when we talk about communication often, or we talk about language, we place it in a person's head. But in a way, we forget how we coordinate with our environment and how we draw on events and happenings and our lived experience. And for Ellistrom, if I understood correctly, a person body serves as a mere mediator of, let's say, messages, then something through which we constitute our world in which we live. So when we talk about human-machine communication now, not just only through a machine to talk with others, but with a machine, some say that old models of communication do not apply to engagement with machines. So Guzman and Lewis, for example, see AI as a communicative subject, engaging in ongoing and adaptive communication in people's everyday spaces. In pragmatics, scholars, for example, understand communication with voice assistants in terms of shared understanding, that the user and the machine understand each other. And if they do not, there is, according to them, a communication breakdown because there wasn't any communication. In human-robot engagement, communication depends on, there's a typo, I apologize, depends on an existing common ground of understanding between the two. So in a way, we have the social role of AI as a communicative partner, and then there's the idea of shared understanding. And that is a little bit why I want to say we do not communicate with machines if we say communication is about shared understanding, because there's no understanding from the machine. Elena Esposito has a book published recently called Artificial Communication. And in this book, she wants to say that we should not talk about artificial intelligence because there's no intelligence in those AI or large language models or AI systems, but rather it should be seen as a communication with artificial partners. So she takes like a Luminian approach, if one can say, to communication and puts emphasis on the receiver of information. So it's not about the issue of who puts out the information, but it's about whether the information can be understood by the observer. And if that is successful, then in those terms, we do have communication. And so the understanding here does not come from both parts, but the understanding comes from the receiver. So in this case, in Esposito's case, we would have communication with machines. But for me, it's not only about the understanding, but also how we do engage with machines, how we coordinate, especially when something appears like what could be perceived as a communication breakdown. So how do we get over it? And who decides that there is no understanding? So what is communication? Again, it seems like understanding is the key term here. When we talk, we kind of assume that we do understand each other. But here I would like to quote Jon Stewart, who says, if human language is not stereotyped, how do human beings ever communicate correctly by talking? A part of the answer is that in general, we probably understand each other far less than we fondly imagine. And he went on, and I only have a bit of this quote here, and then he says, I'm not saying that we do not understand each other at all, only that our understanding is not and cannot be 100% perfect, as the information transfer model would suggest is possible. So we all have probably experienced it, that most of the time when we talk to people, we actually do not understand what they're saying. Perhaps sometimes later we do understand, but in the moment, we somehow still make it work. Because we do not only rely on what is said, but also on how we say it. So when we think the images we see now with ChatGPT, it's a hype, everyone is raving about it, and we see these images. Here I had from a German website where an image from Midjourney, the author generated an image via Midjourney, AI-based image creator, and another newspaper article, online article. And I just want to refer to these images. So what you always see ahead, we always see like this blue and white, blue, white, gray, whatever technological kind of symbolism. And it always kind of puts intelligence, artificial intelligence, attributes it to human capabilities and into the brain. But there is no real focus on, how we do thinking and how we do language. It's kind of the assumption that language is outside people, it exists out of a priori stable entities, and it can be put in a machine who then becomes a communicative partner. That is kind of these images that get perpetuated over time. And especially through artificial intelligence, like as we see with Midjourney, those images more and more get recreated and perhaps become a stable entity in our socio-cultural realities. But what is language and artificial intelligence? And I find that to be quite a difficult question. So if we look at NLP, and I'm not really good at that, so so please bear with me. So here's a call from a Horizon call. And I saw it actually in another presentation, and I thought it was quite interesting that what is said, what natural language understanding is, and what some people envision what programmers, designers, computer scientists should do. So effective AI-based human-machine interaction relies on the grasping of real meaning from natural languages, whatever natural languages are, the recognizing of gestures and activities, understanding of intention, creating and maintaining shared mental models, and designing multi-step interactions. So this description already, well, this call shows that there is an understanding that people think that with these machines, we can have shared understanding and that they can grasp real meaning. And what it does then is that it puts meaning outside of people and outside of people's activities. If we say that meaning can stand in itself, but most of the time it cannot. Most of the time it emerges through contexts or situations or when we deal with the unknown. So often if we have like one word, but the meaning can be so different in different circumstances. So here's the idea, again, gets perpetuated, that language can be treated as a stable entity. And again, remember, most of the time we do not understand each other, I would say. I mean, I agree with John Stewart here. So language and AI then, so machines cannot process human natural text, whatever that might like text. They run on numbers, and they need numbers, and they can only deal with like aspects of words. So human language-based text needs to be made workable for a machine. So natural language processing relies on breaking text into tones, word or word components to train large language models, for example, through tokenization, stemming, or lemmatization. So they work with specific components, and noise has to be reduced. And then the question, of course, is who decides what is noise in a corpus to train a machine? So most important task in NLP then is to make a machine predictable and workable so that people can engage with it. Through vectorization, text is converted into vectors of numbers. So machines deal with numbers and not so much words. This then kind of leads to the question, with what are we dealing when we engage with machines? So we think we talk to them, but actually, and this is the point I want to make later, is we kind of coordinate with what appears to be disembodied entities in a machine. So what tokens to use does not depend on words, but character co-occurrence on information. So here we can see, and I took that from the article from Malwald and colleagues, how GPT-3, they kind of visualized how GPT-3 processes language and what they rely on. And here we can see that the sentence, for example, GPT-3 can be used for linguistics, is then divided into different entities and tokens for the machine to use, to then make predictions or probabilities to look what token would most likely come after the other token. So the GPT-3 training objective is then to predict the next word based on a fixed number of previous word pieces. Predicted word piece compared with a ground truth that occurs in the training sentences. So the idea of ground truth is then to find in the training data. So whatever has been in the training data is then the ground truth the model works on. And then the feedback signals it receives get propagated back to the model to update the parameters. That is as much as I can do with this. I'm so sorry, but that's how I kind of understood it. So here again, there is a figure from the Malwald article where they show that GPT-3 can produce text that obeys most of the standardly accepted grammatical rules of English. So it's trained with a specific grammaticalization of language, which gets reproduced through the model. This has, of course, huge implications in sociolinguistics when we come to the question of what languages are in the model, how do they get reproduced, what languages are dominated, what does it mean for other languages, etc., etc. So linguistic structures determines workings in large language models. For Bender and Kohler, also a very famous article on natural language understanding, they say, of course, that these machines cannot reason because they only work on form and not on meaning. Form for them is to be an observable realization of language, marks on a page, pixels or bytes, and meaning is the relation between form and something external to language. So I agree with Bender and Kohler, of course, that these machines cannot understand. But I do not agree 100% with how they treat and see language, because of course it's a very structuralist view that we say form and meaning relate to each other and that language is something outside of us. So Again, they also think there can be a ground truth, and they think there can be something outside of us. So for Ben and Collar, communicative intent is outside of language. So this leads to separating a reality which people live from language. And it does not take into account that the reality we live, we kind of bring forth through language, because we live in a language world and we cannot escape language. For example, they say, when we say open the window, or when was Malala Yousafzai born, the communicative intent is grounded in the real world the speaker and listener inhabit together. Of course, there is like something of course there are similar sociocultural embeddings that make talking and languaging work, but we do not only inhabit a real world, but through our engagements, we bring forth a real world as we perceive it to be real. That is what I later want to say. So for example, if we take this example with open the window, we do not just refer to something, let's say, that's outside of us. What we do when we use open the window and refer or show or point in our immediate environment to a window, which I'm doing just now because it's in front of me, I constantly ascribe or make it part of my reality that it is a window through my languaging. If I would start recursively calling it something else, then it wouldn't be a window anymore. So it's part of my social reality, and that's how I use language as well. And so it's not just referring to something that is outside of me, but it's actually helping me to upkeep or maintain the world which I inhabit, let's say, or how I see the world or my socio-cultural reality. So Ben and Collar's point is that LLMs work on form, and we shall not assume any reasoning from a machine because they cannot understand, and I agree with that. So from this logic then, but what do we do then when we engage with machines? So one could say, or I say that, we engage with linguistic entities adopted to the machine through mathematical logic, which is way beyond me. So what I want to say is, on the one hand, we are kind of engaging with the disembodied, entities in a way. Later on, I also make the point that they used to be embodied, and then they become disembodied. So machines do not understand, but who does the understanding? Elena Esposito would say the receiver. So let's go to the receiver, or in my case, observer. I did a case study on how people engage with voice assistants. My idea was to do a longitudinal study and observe over a longer time how people adapt to smart speakers in their homes, how they integrate them in their homes, how they use their bodies to talk with them, and how it might change. And also the impact of other members of the household on how we perceive those voice assistants. It's quite difficult to find people filming themselves and how I envision it as a researcher. Perhaps many of you can relate. So, and filming for me was important, not just interviews, because I wanted to see changes in their bodies and in their movements over time. So the case study kind of consists of two data sets of video data and of video data, but also interviews. But here I focus on the video data. One set is from my home. Actually, here we can see my daughter engaging with the Google Home, and one set is from another is another person, a student, who filmed herself for 1.5 months. And we will focus on an instance from this case study. So here, and thanks to Muhammad for the transcript, who is also here, we have now an instance where my participant A, I just call her A, is engaging with Alexa. And she's from the Lebanon. And I asked her before if she could try to start or try speaking Arabic with Alexa, because I learned that recently there's also an option of using Arabic with Alexa. And here's an instance where she did that. I do have a video for it, but because this might be posted on YouTube or uploaded on YouTube, I decided not to show the video, so we kind of have to make do with the transcripts, I'm afraid. Later, I also show a few screenshots. But so she was trying and talking with Alexa, and asked something like, so how are you? And she got an answer, and she said to her boyfriend, oh, she's actually cute, she sounds cute. And then her boyfriend moves from the kitchen to the living room and says, Alexa, make the sound of a chicken. And he does that in English, although the settings were set to Arabic. So Alexa replies in Arabic, which I cannot possibly read to you, but the English version is, here's the answer from Alexa's user's account. Chickens can be very loud. The rooster crows day and night, and not just at sunrise. The rooster can move the whole, this was inaudible, and the chickens grow and crow. And here, what we can see, what happened, that the machine processed the input sound and then gave an answer about chickens' sound and their capability, apparently, of sound. For our participant, she perceives it as poetic and decides that the machine misunderstood the question. And that she was then saying, she was Alexa, describing to you the different sounds of a rooster. So interesting is also that then participant A goes on and then says in Arabic, make the sound of a rooster, and uses a colloquial expression from her Arabic variation, and then uses a modern standard Arabic word for rooster, which also has been used by the machine. So here we see an adapting and coordinating to the machine, because it was programmed with modern Arabic, standard Arabic. Sometimes also in different circumstances in Saudi Arabic. For the user, when I interviewed her, she said for her Alexa sounded Saudi. And interesting was too that she said she never talked to someone speaking Saudi. So, but what happened here, and actually what I want to say is that Alexa worked on the entity of sound, but then phenomenologically for the person, the machine did not understand. And the user begins to kind of adapt to the capabilities of the machine, and also changes, kind of debating for herself what language variation she should speak and how she should adapt to the machines. So we can see that the machine did not process the entire sentence, but only tones and words. So in another example, she then went on and asked again. Here we can see the instance of making the sound of a chicken, which was really successful. So Alexa's the output was, I didn't understand, I hope you try again. Rather than saying make the sound, participant A then says play the sound of a rooster. So here we can see changing her ways of languaging. And Alexa's output is, I'm not sure what that means. Then the boyfriend again in the background says in English, Alexa, make the sound of a chicken. There was only a beep to hear, so there was no response. Participant A infers from that beep that she doesn't understand. And then she asks a more elaborate question. So she doesn't give a command in a way, but she asks a question and says, how's the sound of a rooster? Again, not sure about that, etc. There's a message in the chat. Should I reply to that? Okay, that's interesting. Maybe we can talk about that later. I would like to hear about that. Okay. So, but then what it did to her, so she gave up on asking about the rooster. I mean, it's very, very quotidian thing. It's not that interesting. But it's interesting, but it's about very simple things, right? But then she's participant A says, maybe it's called something different. And then she asked about the sound of a cat. And what she does here, and Mohammed can also correct me if I got this wrong, but in one sentence, participant A changes her language variation. So she asks, how's the sound? And here she says, I probably pronounce it incorrectly, Avessa. And I would say it as cat in Arabic language variation. And then she says, or a kita, cat in modern standard Arabic. So here again, she adopts to the machine. But what the machine picks up is the word for sound, as we can say here. So then the answer or the output is, through gas, sound travels as waves. Of course, it's completely off what participant A has expected. And she says to her boyfriend, okay, that's different. She's describing the qualities of the voice or sound. And one could say there's a communication breakdown, because it is not what the observer, participant A, and her boyfriend together have expected. But let's say if she just would have gone with the flow and say, okay, then tell me about sound. I mean, I'm open to change. I don't care. Then the communication, if it would have been one, would have gone on. But what I want to say is that this example nicely shows that these machines work on tokens and words, and not as we do on sentences, because we are phenomenological beings and we are social beings. And we perceive language, of course, and our ways of languaging way differently than a machine does. And I put that here again in a box. So voice assistants as well, like large language models, even though there is speech and it does something to us phenomenologically, to hear sound, it leads us to anthropomorphize machines more. We saw this in this transcript. There was the assigning that it's a female voice, and so it was she, and it was a person she doesn't understand. It was treated as a communicative partner. But in the end, these machines as well do work on text. So again, through speech and through voice, we coordinate with text-based digital entities in a way. And then, of course, they're linked with information retrieval algorithms, which links them to the web. And often everyone, or perhaps most of us, have used smart speakers, often get pages read from Wikipedia or whatever. But what's interesting too, what I also wanted to mention from my study, from my home study with the Google Home Assistant, my daughter, for example, she likes to listen to a German, what is a kids audiobook, and it's called in English, The 3 Question Marks. And it's written like it's written text-based, but question marks is like 3 real question marks, the symbols. When she asked or commanded the machine to play the 3 question marks, the output was, I play the 3, then there was a brief pause, and then it went on. So it read the question marks and couldn't process it and couldn't read it out loud. So there was a pause. It also showed very nicely how it works on tokens in a way. So, what is also interesting, and that is just a side note, how in my study, just when I started the study with participant A, ChatGPT was released. And when I asked her in an email, how's it going? She wrote to me, I am surprised that Alexa is not that smart. And then I later asked her in an interview about it. And she also said to me how, I thought she would be smarter. ChatGPT does this and this and this. So with the introduction of large language models and their capability of simulating human dialogue so well, smart speakers appear to be stupid now. So that's just as a side note. So person A here coordinated with tokens of the device, or the tokens that the device was able to process. So I want to say that she coordinated with disembodied entities, and that the actual embodiment happens through the user. We can see here, this is my daughter who tried to make Google, the Home Assistant, that should stop. And it was only day 3 of when we had the device at home, and she was 3 years old at the time. And when she wanted to say stop, she couldn't say, okay, Google, stop. It took her actually half a year to learn that command. to grasp the reality of such a device, she acted from her experience of engaging with people and how she learned in kindergarten to say stop, and that is to use your hand to show with your flat palm and say stop. And she tried it with a device and it didn't work, and then she just gave up and listened to, it was in French then, listened to the French output and was just happily drawing. But it also showed that she tried to kind of coordinate in a way how she was used to it with people, but it didn't work with the machine because it's not a sensing thing, right? It's not open, it cannot adapt to human movement. So we have to go from code-based views on language to human activity. And here I want to cite Paul Thibault from his book, Distributed Languaging. And he says, whereas a language-based conception of language, an absence of embodied selves and the activities and taskscapes with which languaging is necessarily integrated, forces a reliance on assumed pairings of forms and meanings as the criterion for determining meaning. The languaging perspective of the present study shows that meaning of utterances is emergent in the activities with which they are integrated and which utterances to varying degrees constitute. So here again, the focus is on how we do language, how we are embodied, but also socially integrated, and the circumstances we meet through different events, happenings, contingencies. That's all how we do language. So we cannot just assume the pairings of forms and meanings as they do in the Horizon call, but we have to look at how meaning emerges through our activities with others. So the languaging perspective actually emerges from the negative argument that language cannot be reproduced to a priori stable entities, or in other words, words. So rather, language needs to be treated first and foremost as human bodily activity. And then language as we understand it, like in a systemic view as a German or English, etc., is then a second order construct. So Thibault in 2011 says first order languaging, that is the first phase, one could say, of human activity, comes before the second language construct as a whole body sense making activity that enables persons to engage with each other in forms of co-action, to integrate themselves with and to take part in social activities that may be performed either solo or together with other agents. And then the second order construct, and here Nigel Love describes it for the integrationist, a language is a second order cultural construct, perpetually open-ended and incomplete, arising out of the first order activity of making and interpreting linguistic science, which in turn is a real-time, contextually determined process of investing behavior or the products of behavior. Thibault says the ability to recognize linguistic sames is based on the same ability to perceive things conceptually. Humans do so in ways that draw on both individual and collective dimensions of experience. So phonology and lexicogramma thus refer to community population scale dynamics on historical cultural timescales. So the idea of a second order construct then is that when we say words in German or in English, we perceive them as the same. Another colleague called them, but they are repeatable. We are able to repeat them through our coordinated engagement and recursive engagement with other people, which starts at baby infant interaction. We learn to act upon what we perceive. We learn to act upon specific, to perceive specific articulatory gestures as the same. And these have a cultural dimension because they are deeply integrated in our culture, in our sociocultural embedding. And this is what these people from this perspective understand as a slower scale of human engagement, which plays a crucial role. And that's why they say that languaging or distributed language, they also call it, is multiscalar. This means that we draw on slower timescales of human being, of human becoming incorporated in our real-time engagement. So one could say there are 4 parts that we draw on the bodily coordination. So what we do in real time, we act upon or react to the movements of others. We can see here in the picture right below that we use our hands. We also hold on to material artifacts. We observe the other closely. Changes in gaze play a crucial role, also facial expressions and how the other observes us. Also, how we change in position, etc. What I cannot show here is also the use of vocal dynamics, how there are studies showing too how people match in pitch and how this also adds to how we do language. I said before, it is multi-scalar, slow underlying temporal scales play a crucial role. We recursively incorporate aspects of the past, of our past experiences in our languaging. And I already mentioned acting or action and perceiving. It is anti-representational ecological. So we are constantly coupled to our environment and we constantly perceive and react to what we perceive in our environment. So this view emerges from anti-position, if one could say, to the classical view of minds, where we kind of mediate an external reality and that the world is kind of outside of us, whether it's a constant bringing forth and constructing of our own reality. Umberto Maturana and his idea of languaging greatly impacted this perspective. Hence, there is this constructivist aspect to it. Here we can see the interplay of different bodily dynamics, and they play a crucial role in how we do language. So Cowley says, in turning to languaging, the focus falls on activity by living beings. In giving way to movement and cognitive dynamics, one turns to what most have always regarded as extra linguistics, or in NLP, it would be noise. So we have to move from code-like views to movement and becoming. So when we think of machines in terms of codes, regularities, and reproducing of realities, we detach machines from a participatory world that is characterized by the living, by movement, and by becoming. And so the machines do not detach really themselves, but it's kind of with our conception of language as a code, we do the detaching. Becker also says that we have to put the person at center of the expressive image. In this view, we realize the world, we remember it, we shape it for our particular conversations with ourselves, with others, against the ground of persons, of self, in time and space. So languaging is our means of constituting our circumstances and attuning to them, of finding and keeping our footing. Languaging is not imagined in this image as a code or a system of words and rules, but as something like a web. So this web metaphor is actually quite a strong one, I find. Also, nowadays, a lot of people use the fungal metaphor, thinking about how fungi work, how they spin those networks, how through threads they form these entities, which we assume to be and see as stable as the fungi. And thinking about machines and how we are as people, as a coming together of human threads, is quite powerful to think about when we want to ask with whom are we actually speaking when we engage with machines. Oh, just a sec. So the focus here is on coordination, and I just make this briefly because Maturana is always quite difficult. But Maturana has a biological view on cognition, and he focuses on how organisms are coupled to the environment. But he also brings this to linguistic coordination, and he basically wants to say that it's biological, that it's behavior. First of all, it's coordination. He does not so much focus on how the body works and how the coordination is done, but he says it's a coordination of behavior, and it's an ongoing process. And so we do not act with isolated items of behavior. Then the next step, if we see words, it's of what we perceive to be language or whatever, is what we pick out, what we see as silent and on which we draw and constantly incorporate in our sayings and doings. If we repeat a word, how we make it meaningful in specific contexts. So picking something out depends on us, like how we observe our own behavior of what we are doing. First of all, we are engaged in coordinating and doing things. And the second step is to observe, evaluate, and pick out what is important for us. So we talked about common ground, and often if the term common ground has a representation, a ring to it. And it has an appeal to inner representations that are in our head and do not account really to how we actually coordinate when we draw on wordings to act within a cultural ecosystem. And the focus is on our coordination. I'm already way too long and I'm boring probably everyone, so I'm sorry. I'm just trying to keep it quick. So we have to go beyond the word. And if we do so, it enables us to look at how people do language, how they draw on happenings, events, and contingencies. Viewing language as human activity asks for the question of what permeates a person's actions and how do people draw and incorporate underlying sociocultural scales. It gives great attention to a person's lived experience and sociocultural embeddings. Also, past encounters with others determine greatly how we perceive and act in and with the world and how we incorporate the influences of others. So how can we now see languaging in AI? So there are two views. On the one hand, we have the user. We already looked at that. On the other hand, we have people in the system. And briefly, I want to quote or show this quote of John Charter, who published an article saying why being dialogical must come before being logical. And here he takes the view that often our thinking, it's still the Cartesian view of mind and body are separated. Ideas and things exist as entities in themselves. But what he says as well is that he wants to make clear that we have to look at the role of our living bodies, that we have to look at our relation, our living relation to the rest of our surrounding, and also what shapes and organizes our talks and the particular linguistic groups in which we are embedded and the events occurring in our surroundings that make us act with others or act in the world and shape the world. So again, let's return to participant A, we can see here now I have screenshots, how the influence of the others play a role. It's her boyfriend who comes into the room. First, she's oriented at the machine, but then when she gives the answer, she says it is very poetic. She misunderstood you. Of course, she orients to him. So he played a crucial role in this engagement with the device. But then she also, after she tries getting the command through, her boyfriend also says, perhaps she doesn't understand English. And so she immediately looked at the phone because she used it to put in the settings, which also, of course, is connected to the smart speaker. And then she was talking to him and then moving to the device and saying, maybe I have to change my accent a bit. So here we can see how this coordinating together about the device then also has an influence how she changes her own behavior and her actions. And her focus on material artifacts too played a crucial role. So it's where she is sitting, the influences of people around her that kind of determine how she engages with the device. And what we do not see here, because I didn't show the video, is also the facial expressions she did, her changes in tone of voice. There were slight pauses in her giving commands and also slight changes in movements. And other examples I have from my data, one can really see how people go closer and far away from the device when they do not get their commands processed, how they tap it when something doesn't happen, how they break and pause. And yeah, it's quite interesting if we take a whole embodied look. So A, bodily coordinated with the disembodied through the partner and use of material artifacts while drawing on her own sociocultural embedding and thinking about how can I change to make the machine work. However, how disembodied are digital inscriptions in a device really? And then coming to the end, thank you for your patience. NLP doesn't work, or LLMs do not work without training data. And I think most of us know that training data is crawled widely from the internet. And this was produced by people, of course, right? So it's crawled from Reddit, from Wikipedia, etc. And especially if we think about Reddit, Reddit is like a community forum, one could say, where you have different subreddits, they call them, different discussion platform to different topics and different communities, and they exchange and whatever they talk or whatever comments they leave there. But the words they use there or the meanings of these words are inherent to these linguistic groups, one can say. So all of these aspects go into the training data with which a system is trained. We also have labor workers, and everyone probably heard about the big outcry that ChatGPT used Canadian labor workers. They were underpaid and they were exposed to really terrible content, which they had to label so that it would work for us, that we wouldn't be in shock what the machine would say. So in order to avoid that the machine hallucinates, makes up facts, and whatever is used to describe a machine, labor workers have to do the work and label the data. So they're programmers, designers, and importantly, people and companies involved in the process. And if we think about Schotter's quote, we have to think about that each of these people are part of a linguistic community. And every linguistic community have their socio-cultural embedding or also socio reality. So the question then is, whose reality determines in the machine and whose reality gets reproduced? Oh, okay, the slide. So here, what the title says is that data science is actually human activity. So here I want to point to an article from Michelli and colleagues, where they looked at how labor workers or annotation workers at annotation factories work. And it was very interesting. They take a sociological viewpoint and looked at the power dynamics. And so they asked those workers, so do you know what you're working for? Do you know who what the client wants or why he needs all those pictures annotated? And the answer is mostly no, I'm not sure. I don't know about this. In another quote, they say, whenever I cannot resolve the questions annotators bring to me, I ask the leader. If the leader cannot solve them either, we ask QA, question and answer, I guess, given by the client. Otherwise, they ask the contact person at the client's company. So what these quotes show very nicely is that people, often it is thought that the labelers do make the decision and determine the meaning of labels or whatever, but actually they are part of a wider system and they engage with other people. So they do not orient to the data or to the product or for what it might be used. They orient to what the client wants. And of course, it's very capitalistic, and we know which companies run these big systems. And of course, a more Western socio reality gets implemented in these systems. But what it shows nicely is how these annotators do their thinking and their decision-making process, because they rely on the influences of the client or the leader. So they coordinate with others to meet a client's wishes and not so much to make the machine work. So this gives a little insight to how languaging might work in a machine. So thus, human coordination or joint activity, I would say, determines the reality of such systems. And then also the question of what kind of reality gets perpetuated. Again, I said language is not a code. I see it as human activity. And that leads me to say we coordinate with machines. And I kind of wanted to say, and this is a bad graphic, but I kind of wanted to say that there's the embodied and human practices in the machine, which are kind of like disembodied, and then again embodied by the user. So it's a kind of a recursive, I don't know how to call it, maybe you can help me to say, on the one hand, we coordinate with disembodied entities who used to be embodied, but in the end, distributed over time and space, we kind of engage with human practices in the machine when we engage with machine in real time, but just distributed in time and space. So machines are part of the language world. They're part of our world making. Language and machines does not represent an external world outside of us. Rather, it aids to upkeep a sociocultural reality that some of us envision, some bigger companies maybe, and it's part of our languaging process, I would say. bodily movement becomes static and thus codified for a machine. However, we often neglect in our thinking who gives life to the disembodied. Thank you so much for your patience and attention. It has been long, I'm sorry. I'd like to thank Auli for inviting me to be a speaker at this event, and many thanks to Muhammad for helping me with the Reddit data. Yeah, if you like to get in touch, here's my email address if you want to help me with my thinking.
Thank you, Therese. Thank you so much. It's a really interesting presentation. I tried to write down my thoughts. I probably have to rethink a lot, but I'll try to open up with a couple of questions. But just as a disclaimer for everybody else, is like, feel free to raise your hands or just speak up, or but like, just be aware that it's all recorded and it will be on YouTube. So if you're uncomfortable with your face being out there, then just like either don't switch on the video, or you can also just write your question in the chat, because this will not make it to the YouTube. Basically, it's only what's on screen. But maybe to yeah, let me see. Whoever. Anyway, nice to see everybody who wants to switch on their camera, though.
Can you maybe unshare so we can?
Yep.
Thank you.
Sorry.
No, that's great.
Okay. Josh, do you want to start with something?
I mean, sure. I'll just chime in just to get the party started, so to speak. First of all, that was fantastic. That was really, it was nice to see some of your empirical work, and you're touching on a number of different disciplines, grappling with some obviously very hard questions. I think I'll just, maybe one. I'll start with the question actually, and then actually maybe say a provocation, and then just see where it goes from there. I suppose the question is an open question that I myself have been trying to grapple with. The 4E and activist folks, their approach to anti-representationalism, which in my view, I guess I'll embed a provocation in my question, is that in my view, it's a great critique, but I think it goes too far. And we can talk about that. So I guess the question is like, there's a bit of a interesting sort of contradiction in this idea, and your final graphic actually nicely, the sort of recursive notion of how it is we're embodied, and then all of a sudden we're recursively disembodied, and then the recursive call comes back to the embodiment, and goes about its business, where we are in society today with our machines. So it's an interesting conundrum, like from an activist perspective, this idea of it being it simultaneously, very importantly, is embodied, but it's also simultaneously, insofar as it's about coordination with the environment, which, as you pointed out, includes our machines. It's also disembodied. So obviously, there's something else there, I would suggest, that's missing, some other ingredient, if you will, that's entailed in veritable understanding. And I suppose this leads to my provocation, that there's this kind of, both in the chat, the question, one of the questions in the chat, and then you sort of alluded to it as well. There's this sort of notion that well, if only machines could understand us better, and then sometimes people say, oh, well, humans don't understand humans very well, as if that sort of takes machines off the hook or something. I personally think that it misses the point entirely, because from a biosemiotic perspective, Lotmanian perspective, translation and untranslation always have to be in careful ratio in order to have meaning making. In other words, you have to have not understanding, some amount of non-understanding. Otherwise, there isn't meaning making. And I know that sounds contradictory, but we could talk more and more about it. It's a really important concept. So I think to hold ourselves to the quantitative, benchmarks that we test our machines to, that we hold our machines to, and then reflect that back on us and say, oh, well, we're not communicating very well, is a red herring. It's not moving us any closer to understanding true understanding. I would argue, and we can talk more about that. I've got plenty more to say about all that, but let's get some other folks' voices in here. But anyway, great talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your comment. I mean, that's very interesting. I can react to it, right? Just a few things I wanted to say. First of all, with the activism, I mean, I gave up on activism, I have to say. I try to understand, because I always try to understand. And somehow for me, this idea of thinking didn't work to how people work, because it has such a biological view. And I think, I mean, others from the activism camp would now greatly disagree with me. And I know they talk about linguistic bodies, and they know they talk about participatory sense making. Mm-hmm. But for me, it was still always hard to grapple with the idea of autopoiesis and autonomy when we talk about phenomenological and social beings and how they change over time. And I still cannot make sense of it, and I couldn't. But this is something I always had a hard time with. And I know that especially with 4E, when we say, or the 4E's are not all anti-representational. I think there are only 2 E's actually anti-representational of the 4. They have the scaling up problem, of course, for which they have a hard time accounting for. And it's just something I wanted to add to your comment. And now you switched, you're there on my screen. And as for what you said about understanding, I think it's very interesting, because that is, as I said, this is just my current thinking. I'm not trying to make huge claims or anything. And as I said, I don't really know what communication is, and I don't know what understanding is. Is it that we have to have, the same meaning of a thing, or is it enough to say we can carry on with our conversations and see where we end up? Like, as you said, I thought it was very interesting. We need to have non-understanding to make meaning making. Probably there's always a negotiation and stuff, but leads me again with the big question. So what is then understanding for us, and what does it entail for a machine? Because I don't know, to be honest, it always changes. Is it like we can decode a meaning of something, or is it enough to say we can go on with talking, which doesn't necessarily mean we're on the same page of something, you know what I mean? So that is something I was thinking about. Yeah. Thank you so much for your comment. That was very insightful.
Okay, maybe I'll go next with my own idea or comment, what I sort of gathered while listening to you. Like, so you mentioned how every human who is sort of invested in the process of building this AI, from data workers or everybody else who is somehow involved in the process, that they have their own sociocultural embedding and reality, and then it becomes a question of like which one wins out, or the one app that then gets picked up in quite uniform cultures after that. Also, before you mentioned how people, like from your examples, for example, how people sort of try to adapt to the machine capability of processing their speech by changing either language or by changing the subtype of language, I don't know, dialect, if you will, or however you call them. And I just kept wondering, it's like how these things sort of illustrate, but not only AI, but also maybe just like a global level of communication, or some other problems that we have in societies that sort of stem from this globalization, or the fact that in some online spaces or offline also, very different cultures now can come together and clash in the ways they understand each other, or create some kind of communicative issues. And yeah, this with this AI applications now also kind of illustrate how this idea of this common inhabited world that we are supposed to share is actually not so well objectivated, in the sense that, you know, somewhere outside, of course, partially it is processable somehow without people, because we are capable, you know, law written down and or things like that, although law also comes down to interpretation to a lot of cases. But there is still, I mean, there is a lot of stuff that can be sort of taken out of humans and then reinterpreted without them being immediately present. But still, it seems that this amount of text, language, or like cultural artifacts, if you say, if you will, are not, like, it's not as big as we kind of assumed it was, because, you know, we do have significantly a lot more communication issues than I would say a lot of AI people have expected, like, hence the surprises at, you know, why GPT chat cannot do this or that, or fails, you know, generating certain types of text or answering certain types of questions. So so yeah, like, I don't know, do you see any ways linguistics can help at all, like, to, you know, because in semiotics we sort of, I mean, one thing is to point out that yeah, we, you know, it's not that simple. Like, it's very easy to say on anything that, oh, it's not that simple, but I think the problem for AI researchers is also like how to break the problem, you know, in the sense that you can sort of solve it in a reasonable manner and still implement stuff in AI. But like, can linguistics help at all? Or like, even with this languaging issue, like, to demonstrate, can we at all include these embodied aspects somehow? Can we encode them still and sort of process them, or is it like, is it just too big a task for, I don't know, for like 1 century of humans to solve, or something like that, if it makes any sense?
Yeah, that was a very complex question. Let me see whether I can give an appropriate answer. So I cannot talk for linguistics, as you might have figured, but I've been thinking about the question. You know, we talk about languaging, and languaging is about how the subtle things of how we engage with others and how they contribute to our engagement. And I've been thinking, how on earth would you want, like, why would you want to put it in a machine? First of all, do we have to? That's often a question. Like, how human does the machine have to be, and for what purposes? That is something I'm thinking about. And second, you know, how would you do the coding? I mean, everything is very spontaneous. I'm sorry for the background noise. It's family time. I'm sorry if you hear the crying of the child.
I can't.
Okay, sorry. It's difficult always. But because everything is so spontaneous, and I wonder, you know, how, like, let's say if it could be codified, you would need so many amounts of data and everything. And then we get to another issue, and also our reality issue, the environment. Like, how many servers would you actually need to run these systems if you want to get the complexity of how humans work? I mean, I really wonder. So I think the question for me is always, do we need artificial, what is a general AI, like, intelligence? Like, do we actually need human, like, artificial intelligence, and for what purposes? Or is it just a sci-fi thing? Or can it be smaller and on specific cases, etc.? And yeah, so, or does it have to be for all? Or I don't know, but that's kind of what I'm thinking. I'm not sure it kind of gave an answer to your question, to be honest.
I didn't even mean so much this debate over AGI, but rather just just an example, like in social robotics or like assistant robots, or I don't know, I think people are developing like robots that are supposed to help children with speaking, for example, who have trouble for various reasons, sort of like adapting to cultural environments and so on. So like the speaking assistants, which may be difficult to organize when the child maybe doesn't feel so well speaking with another human being, but would actually get the speaking assistance from a machine rather. Like, I don't know, certain types of autistic people or other, there's all kinds of like necessities or like needs out there. So I mean, in this sense, it would be sort of desirable to have, you know, a machine that could sort of like imitate to the best of that cultural context, you know, the way people are supposed to speak, just to be like of assistance. So yeah. So there's also all these extra linguistic capacities basically to consider.
Yeah, and I think for that's very interesting. And I also read papers where they try to, you know, the embodied aspects of talking or using lips or and training, you know, more the embodied aspects. And I think that is important, but I'm not sure it would. I mean, it's also an interpretation then of these people who observe that kind of behavior, right? And I mean, it could be helpful. Of course, I didn't say with that talk that I'm against it or in any way. I'm just like trying to say like the aspects we can think about and perhaps not giving too much emphasis to a machine being like a human at some point or something. That's more of what I wanted to say. The question is always like whose intentions are in the machine and how do they observe the world and what do they think? Yeah, like how they kind of see the world and what others do. That's kind of, I think, what I might wanted to say. And now I'm babbling, but I think sorry.
All right, yeah, no, apologies. I just if it suits you guys, there's an interesting question in the chat. That I think one of the really interesting things about your talk is your focus on coordination. And so this question, as you could probably read it, feel free. Do you want to read it out loud, or do you know what I'm referring to?
Yeah, I think, should I do?
Yeah, sure, go for it.
So the question is from Lavinia, right? I see you're here on my screen. Do you want to pose the question or should I just read it?
Yeah, that's fine. Thank you for sharing those provoking thoughts. So one of the key things that I was wondering about is whether you could talk a little bit more about your choice of the concept of coordination as opposed to thinking about language adaptations or other types of languaging, because I think that one of the interesting things in your talk that has emerged for me was this idea that, you know, we're trying to sometimes go to the essence of language and languaging. And the question is, do we need an argument by essence, or do we need a different type of argument that doesn't go to the essence of communication, understanding, so on and so forth, but thinking about reaching out to other symbol-making systems or forms of languaging, which would allow us to talk about what is human, about the human communication, but also how we can still language with other different systems. So that's why I brought in the concept of coordination as opposed to other types of concepts.
Yeah, that is a very good question. So I'm thinking, so I think what the concept of coordination rather allows is the focus of the body, or that's how I see it. You know, I'm presenting my view here, kind of. So how I understand it is also what I'm looking at in my data is like the interplay of different bodily dynamics. So if we talk about language adaptation, and I'm not familiar with the theory or anything, but from my understanding, the focus would be on words, how we adapt the words. But languaging, in a way, lets us go beyond the word, and also focuses on, so where do, like, it sounds plain and simple, but when do we change gaze? Where do we look at? How do we position ourselves? And bringing that into play with what is said, we can look at how we make use of our environment from a cognitive sense, how we make use of different epistemic resources and cognitive resources, and how we change ourselves. So how we change as people, how we bring forth personhood and identity. And I think that is a little bit where the languaging perspective sets on, from the complexity, where are we embedded as persons? How do we bring different aspects of our lived experience into play? So it's not just so much as looking at how we speak perhaps in different language systems, but moreover, how do we bring forth personhood, etc. And I think in this way, if we look at the body and how we coordinate, we can kind of go beyond the bridge of different language systems. So for example, there's this idea of translanguaging, which also says that language should not be seen as different language systems, but often when we translanguage, which could be seen by linguists as code switching, it's rather our kind of flow of coordination that we're doing. It's not so much going between different systems, but that is languaging for us, kind of. So the sociocultural embedding on which we draw and our experiences, and how, let's say, I think Leeway used the term of what is it, Chinese English. I mean, there's a term for it, but how it's also kind of perceived as a language in a way which for some other linguists would not be a language, So it depends on kind of how we are able to coordinate, and it depends on these underlying bodily dynamics, which we often do not recognize and are hard to put into transcripts as well. So for example, my supervisor, Stephen Cowley, he did a study in his PhD where he looked at Italian family conversations, and he noticed how moms and daughters kind of, it was not so much about what they said, but it was about how they met in pitch and how they kind of moved each other on the vocal dynamics into being and into other actions. And it could have been nonsense what they say, but it was more on this vocal level that understanding meaning or whatever happened. So that's a little bit when I talk about coordination. It's not just about the word, but what's beyond the word. I'm not sure you agree with that, but that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. No, that's very interesting. I think it goes back to what's your point of reference, right? Is it the human body, or is it any other entity or key concept around which you are putting everything else in the spin? Because body language is a dimension that defines the human body, but that doesn't mean we cannot understand other systems of languaging that do not put the human body as the primary point of reference. So yeah. Very interesting point.
Sorry.
Hello, thank you for the presentation. The aspect of like communicating with the smart device, like Alexa, for instance, this is something that I wrote about in my master's thesis about like smart home technology. Because with this, I went into this MA thesis looking at it as meta communication. It's the user using the system of the smart home, for instance, to communicate with the actual designer. But even when it comes to interacting with the smart device, in a way, it still very much fits into this basic communication model of sender, text, receiver. One of the aspects I was kind of looking at in the thesis was about animals communicating to the device. There's instances where there was a parrot ordering stuff from Amazon, or the parrot turning on lights in the actual space. So, it's one of those things that, even with mimetic language, the, non-human species will still able to understand the actual interaction of what happens if you say turn on light. But, it was interacting with it. It was very interesting to think about, but also when you started talking about the tone of pitch, it made me think about also how for Amazon, when it comes to an adult user versus a child, they determine this based off the pitch frequency. So the pitch itself of the actual text determines what content you're given. So it's one of those things that, I can see what you're saying when, we don't communicate to machines or with machines for that matter, but, it's built off of human meaning for that matter, because it derives from the actual design team, and, just the corporations associated to it. So, it is one of those things that the text, it kind of does reformulate depending on what sort of components are integrated into this like design aspects. Factoring in like Lotman's five levels of a text, that's something where that leads to a whole nother aspect. Does a machine truly know what a text is? And short answer, I would say no, just because it requires a lot of cultural memory. There's a lot of secondary modeling, that it's not really designed for. But with this, I think one of the biggest issues when it comes to language and AI is how AI itself, it's not built off this paradox of what is real versus what is true. Because semiotics itself, we investigate what is real. It relies on multiple interpretations of one physical object, for instance. When we start computing language as just ones and zeros for that matter, it strips away sarcasm, it strips away, artistic text for that matter. So it's one of those things that like, for me as a researcher, this is like the main point, like once AI can understand the distinction of true versus real, then I do think we can communicate with machines, because then at that point, this unpredictability comes into play. This untranslatability is a little bit more apparent rather than being lost in communication, kind of like what your example emphasized in regards of the actual language input. But it is one of those things that, yeah, because like, when it comes to ChatGPT, that's a whole nother story, because it was a wildfire globally. So, I could see from like, the global consensus how, there's this communication shift happening. But, for people in the humanities, it's a little bit different because we very much do rely on what is real for that matter. But even then, if the Amazon Alexa can't distinguish that, this is a bird, it feeds into this lack of the paradox.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Thank you for the comment. So now I'm thinking about the whole wheel thing,
I would
always, yeah, Ollie, sorry.
I think it's not so much a question about like when and whether and how AI can understand what's real, but still first is the question of how we can encode, so to speak, the true facts out there and then make it available for AI to compete through. But yeah, that's my input, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I kind of agree to that. So what I wanted to say with the real, I always have the issue because we kind of course, act from our standpoint of what we think is real. And I think that's also where the problem comes when people talk about that machines hallucinate or they make up facts. but that is the position of the observer who's saying that from their sociocultural embedding that is not true. Or if it works really well, or it says the correct things, I mean, it can go both ways, but it comes from our kind of linguistic community and embedding from a community where people agree upon something, that something is a fact or something is not. So I have a constructivist view here. And then the thing is about what is a fact or what is not a fact, as Auli said, I think, is then what the people who have a say in how to design and change the machines, it's kind of their reality, what's in there, and they kind of have to think about what the reality of the user might be in order for the machine to make it work for their reality. And that's kind of what I wanted to say. So in a way, what we also do when we communicate, engage, coordinate, however you want to call it, what we do with these things, we kind of engage with the past anticipations of designers. And sometimes their past anticipations are, hit the mark, and sometimes they work and sometimes they don't. And especially with ChatGPT and reinforcement learning, when you talk to people about ChatGPT, then they always say, yeah, it told me it cannot say this. And how it became very careful what it can say and what are facts and about what it can have an opinion. So there's this human influence of kind of, I don't know, monitoring the reality in which we're in. So I always have a problem about talking about the truth and something real, because it always depends on the standpoint of the observer. And as for the parrot, which is very interesting, do you have a source for that? I would love to read about it.
This was just like, if you YouTube parrot talking to Alexa, you'll see videos. So it wasn't any like scientific research. It was just me trying to find like real life examples of this phenomenon, essentially.
So and you put that in your master's thesis. Okay, would love to read that actually. Sure. So that's because that makes one think about. So did what's your take? Do you think the parrot, can we do that kind of dialogue thing? But the others can jump in too, and I think it's very interesting, because I said I don't know what communication is, so you guys should help me out. So I'm glad about this this community here. But I'm just curious. So what do you think what the parrot did? I mean,
I think in a way the parrot performs like biological processes. It's doing something that is just natural to its umwelt.
Yeah.
It's irrelevant for the parrot. It's irrelevant if it's communicating to a human or to the Alexa for that matter. It was ordering strawberries for, it enjoyed strawberries. It knew what a strawberry was. So it added it to the shopping cart for Alexa or for Amazon. It couldn't actually place the order, but it still continued adding more and more things to the shopping cart. So again, from the consumer aspect side of things, it's concerning in a way. So what happened, like, I don't know. So in a way, for the parrot, it's just like this intrinsic process. So the object, it's the thing that it's communicating with in its environment. It's more or less, it doesn't really matter if it's a human or the AI for that matter. For human communication, that's a whole nother different story. But in a way, because like you started the presentation talking about how it's human involvement. So that was kind of the first thing where I was trying to understand, like from my past research, how this kind of fits into your approach. Because when it comes to metacommunicative design and designing something for a future audience, for that matter, so much of it is related to the design process, and it relates back to like the romantic user and the decent user, the actual person, the use cases that they're doing with it, and so on. But if it's not being properly scaffolded or like reformed to actually provide a positive, constructive output, kind of puts you in a box in a way. But in the sense of like a basic communication model as sender text receiver, I do see it fitting, you know, because but yeah, Josh, you have something to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna riff off the communication question, because it's a great question that we all should be asking. Well, we all, you know, most of us who our various disciplines are coming at it from slightly different perspectives. But I'm also trying to see what we can take from an activist community, because they do have some good insights. But like I said, I think they've gone too far. But one thing that I think they're really on the mark with is even tying in the parrot example, which is fantastic, is that the parrot, like us, has its own umwelt, as Alec was saying, and that which basically means we have our own embodied experience. We have that which we're sensitive to, we've evolved to be sensitive to in our environment. And I think one key distinction, all machines, no matter how many sensors you bolt on to our digital machines, they don't sense in the way that we sense. They aren't sympathetic to their world in the way that we're sympathetic. We're literally affected by energetic patterns in our world. They literally reform us. Digital machines are specifically designed not to be reformed. That's their genius. Their genius is how they have been able to edit out noise, as you rightly talk about in your talk, is that noise really is, well, from my perspective, my own body of work, noise is really critical. It's in the eye of the beholder, as you keep rightly saying. And so kind of one of the takeaways, one of the punchlines, if you will, is that digital machines don't relate to themselves. They're a series of non-relations all the way down, because that's exactly how the transistor is very much on purpose designed. It's not to relate to other transistors, in the sense that the mutual exclusivity of their state is built in, is a feature, not a bug. But then that precludes them from relating to itself, let alone the environment, to itself in the way that bodies relate to both themselves and their environment, because we're intrinsically sympathetic, we're intrinsically affected, we're intrinsically molded and modified, and noisy and crosstalk and confused and ambiguous. And that's, again, for us, a feature, not a bug. So in answer to your question, or maybe not answer, but certainly a clue for all of us that I would argue for, at least, is that that there's to the question of communication is that distinction, that there's a very fundamental distinction there, and it's all very much on purpose. And but we have these confusions of mind that as humans we like to project. We anthropomorphize. So we go out of our way to make machines not like us, exactly so that they can do things very well that we don't do very well. In other words, you might as well just call them artificial optimization machines. They're very good at automating optimization. That's what we designed them to do. We don't do that very well. We can do it, but we just, it's not our strength. We can do it enough to make machines that can do it better than we can, and then we point to the machines and say that they're smarter than us, which is it's a complete red herring. It's a complete shift. We're doing all sorts of things. You know, you made an interesting comment. I think I jotted it down. Something about like very simple things for us. So you said something about like very simple things, and I think what happens a lot of times, like your 3-year-old can do things that machines still can't do and will never do the way they're currently designed. But I'll leave it at that.
I was nodding the entire time. I totally agree with you, and I think that was an interesting take to think further what I actually wanted to say. And I really liked your point about the artificial, what did you say?
Optimization.
Optimization. That is exactly it, right? I mean, when you read about artificial intelligence, there are always these examples of chess, and when Kasparov was beaten by the first chess computer and everything. But then I read too, there was not taken into consideration that a person is tired and might not be so focused, and the machine is just fed with the experience in the way of so many chess players and calculates on their moves, of course. And then it's like the machine is smarter than we are, but no, it wouldn't be without us, or without the people that program them, not without me, but the people that make them.
There's another, and then we could hand it off to Lavinia, but there's another, just off your chess example, just quite recently, a lab showed that even with AlphaGo, like the fact that they built that machine that could defeat the top AlphaGo player in the world, and which is quite impressive. Like it's a great tool. Don't get me wrong. It's a great tool. But what's interesting is another lab came along and was able to show how it is you could take a very mid to low level strategy and consistently 97% of the time beat actually an advancement upon the AlphaGo machine, an even better machine. They actually were consistently able to take a very mediocre strategy and beat the machine, because the machine doesn't actually know how to play.
Yeah.
So it's not really what it's just optimized on the best players on a whole corpus of data, a whole corpus of looking for the structures that talk about structuralism. It's just automated structuralism, and it's trained on the best Go players. It's not trained on mediocre Go players. But anyway.
So the mediocre Go players can beat the machine and the best cannot.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, Lavinia has raised her hand again. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was also thinking, what if we change the question, and instead of saying what is communication or what's human communication, we're going for how do we achieve any form of communication? Because, and I was thinking about the Arrival, the movie, where you have these alien entities who are starting to communicate in a totally different system. And the question there is not what is it, is this like, although there is a little bit of, how does this match up our own system of establishing and sending messages? But the question there is, how do we breach the gap between our system and their system? So the question there is not what is human communication or what is communication, but how do we achieve communication across competing, interests, desires, symbols, sign making systems, all of that. And I'm thinking back to the example of the bird, which I think is fabulous too. I really enjoy that. So thank you, Alec. And there, is another example of, should we ask the question, what's communication here? Is this communication? And instead think about how is, any sort of intentionality, symbolic intentionality achieved across these two different entities, which are non-human, right? One is a bird, a living organism, and the other one is a machine programmed as it is. And I'm also thinking, how many of these things that we say machines cannot do at the moment will become possibilities in the future. Not that they will be, human-like 100%, because why should they? Why again? What's our point of reference? Why are we so, infatuated with our own beings to put ourselves always at the center? But yeah, these are more kind of provocations than anything else. So.
Yeah, Therese, do you want to comment or?
I could write. I thought it was a very interesting question. So, but then like, it's always, yeah, the how question. It's like, so how we do we do things? Because I'm interested in that. How do we do things? I'm not so much interested in finding out what things can be or how they're called. I always have a hard time with it because I feel like I never grasp concepts really, because there's so many different interpretations. But then, yeah, I wonder, like, with communication. So yeah, when you said that about, so when we ask, so how do we do communication? But then again, it's kind of, so when we say what we do, but then it also implies that we say it as communication, you know. I feel like, can these be can these two questions, sorry, be kept apart in a way? Of course they influence each other. I don't know, you know. I mean, I still
it wasn't so much a question, it was more like as I said, a provocation, something to think about, because I think that oftentimes we are driven by these sorts of equivalences, right? So we define communication in a particular way, and then we expect that all systems kind of operate more or less in relation to that, to whatever definition we came up with. And I think that might get us stuck at some point in the extent to which we can answer that question. And for me, what's more interesting is how do we define communication in various contexts, and then try to see what kind of bridges we can establish between those, because otherwise, you know, kind of going to this global scale, but we are doomed if we find another alien species and we are not able to build those inter-systems bridges. You know, if we start with a specific definition of what communication is, then we confine ourselves within the box. And I think that one of the challenge of these systems, although we've said that at the core, you know, they go back to the perspectives, the stereotypes, the prototypical concepts that humans have embedded in them, right? But I think they also challenge us to think about how do we get out of the box? How do we get out of our key concepts that we thought we understood and defined up to this moment? Because I think we are forced to do that. Otherwise, you know, we're going to circumvent, we're going to go around and say, well, they are not like us in these ways, A, B, C, D. And yes, we can optimize them, or we can train them to fail, although we don't like our machines to fail. So it's a really complicated picture, right? But it's always coming back to us. So for me, what's fascinating in this conversation is to think about how do we get out of our own heads, almost. And I, you know, I don't have an answer, and I think that your work is really fascinating because it kind of pushes some of those limits as well. But it's yeah, it's very fascinating territory.
Thank you. Yeah, this question, as you said, once we start, you know, pushing the boundaries, then kind of in this context let us rethink everything, you know. I mean, it opened up the question of, so what is a machine? What does it mean to be human? It sheds new light on everything, like forcing us to think about that a little bit. Yeah, I like the idea of going out of the box. And yeah.
There's a question in the chat by John early on already. So he asked about programming languages. Basically, there are low-level programming languages and high-level programming languages, which process the human's commands or intention through compiler and linker, but so hence they will introduce ambiguities to programmers' intent. But there is this edge case with especially low-level programming languages where this efficiency of communication could be higher than human-human comms. I don't know, like, do you feel like you have a idea, comment about that, or is it too technical?
Is John still here?
He asked me to read it out.
Oh, okay.
So,
Otherwise, I would have asked him again.
clarification. I don't actually know if he's online, but
high level to process human capacity. So the efficiency of communication, I think that's an interesting point, because it kind of goes to Lavinia's, like, not question you said, but comment of, rather the question is, how do we do communication? And we said, you know, communication has to be seen in different contexts. So I feel like this is a different kind of context of communication we are talking about when we talk about, if I get this right, about programming languages and the machine, because how, like, for what purposes does it have to be efficient, and what kind of communication, like how can communication be more efficient than human to human communication, and efficient for whom? And yeah, I would rather answer with the questions back than I have a proper reply, because I think the idea about efficiency of communication is quite intriguing, because, as I said, for me it opens up rather the question, who needs the efficiency of communication and for what purposes? Yeah,
I'll elaborate a bit. So if I talk about the efficiency of communication between human and human, then as you mentioned also before, it never can be 100%. There's always what one person thinks, or how that person thinks is different how the other person thinks. So the communication always has deficiency. Well, when we define to the computer what we want the computer to do, not in a sense where we are talking about the well-learned machines or the language models, but rather on the programming side. So we define that, let's say we program the computer to do a task. Then on the low-level languages or machine language, you have to be very precise and very deliberate to define what you want the computer to do. And in those cases, the communication from human to the computer through this language can be very precise. And in my opinion, this can be much more precise than from human to human, because human has to know what the computer will do, how the processor will process those commands. Hence, if that program is then well thought through and programmed to the computer, then the computer will do exactly what the human intended to do. And hence the translation there from the human intent to what the computer will do will be, I would say, close to 100%. And the reason I mentioned also the higher level languages, like, I don't know, C, Python, whatnot, is common nowadays. Then you always have a compiler and maybe multiple compilers or linkers in between what the human writes. So even if the human thinks through and does well with defining the task in the higher level programming language, then there are interpreters between the human and what the computer will do. And that's the reason why I mentioned that on the higher level languages, the efficiency of the communication is not necessarily 100%. But this is as an example for you where the communication can be almost perfect, but it's not a human to human interaction.
No, okay.
I think this is what Shannon Weaver basically meant with their communication schema. I mean, this was like, kind of like, yeah, fits that. Although I think there raises this question whether actually when we talk about computer languages, can we call them languages? I know there is a Professor Alan Blackwell from Cambridge. I think he was part of the Cambridge's History of AI seminar series, and he has suggested, or like tries to bring up this, so that we should call computer languages notation systems rather than languages, because calling them languages sort of gives an impression that they function in a similar manner as human languages. But yeah, that's like a definition issue. But
yeah, this is, yeah, for me it also comes down to what do we define as communication, coming to messages and whatnot. In my opinion, the language used to communicate with the computers, the programming language, it is a language. Because we humans, when we teach new people how to program, it is a new language, new way to communicate. They have to learn. Although there is no visual communication there, you cannot do hand gestures yet. But it's still a new way you have to formulate your intent to the recipient of the command. So it is a language method. Yeah.
Josh.
Yeah, this is all very interesting, and it's something I just want to highlight that what you've already said. I want to say Teresa, but that's not what your name is. What is it? Oh, you're muted.
Therese.
Therese. Okay.
I always say Therese, and then if I introduce
Therese.
myself, I say without E and A at the end. I mean,
Okay.
it's a hard concept for people.
So you were, I think there, we can talk about, this is kind of the what and the how kind of conundrum too, is like are we trying to solve, like what's the scope of the problem we're trying to solve? Like if we're trying to, efficiency is really, Ali rightly brings up Shannon and Weaver in this case to bring it back to the origins of communication theory, as they called it. But of course, there's an ambiguity already because the Shannon was very clear about saying that he's not worrying about, he's prescinding, he's not talking about meaning making, but I suspect we are, like that you are interested in meaning making, and that meaning for humans and all other animals and the biosphere as a whole is predicated, is embedded in an open system, and it's an open indeterminate system. And so that's what billions of years of evolution has evolved to deal with and to sustain itself, is in that system. Now, when we're talking about efficiency, we're assuming, as you rightly highlighted, we're assuming that there's some sort of a priori set point that can constitute, some sort of pre-chosen case. Whether, well, we can talk about Carnot efficiency and thermodynamics, but I don't think anyone here is talking about that. Or we can talk about it a Shannon Weaver sense of, redundancy and those kinds of concerns. And all these things are very useful, and we can have very productive conversations about them, but we're always at risk of talking past each other if we're not very clear on what it is. I think you did clarify is that, like, what we're interested in. If we're interested in meaning making and making meaning in an indeterminate open system, then we have to be suspicious. We have to at least ask the question of, like, efficiency for whom, and by what measure, and what's the, if it's a technical goal, then great, let's do that. But if we're talking about meaning making amongst animals, then that's a broader, larger conversation.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Josh, on that, because as also Oli said, it's a good comment with the programming languages, but as Oli also said, the question is, are they languages? And then the question again, I mean, we use them for a purpose to do something as well, right? And we use our kind of languaging to make sense of these programming languages as well. I mean, I know I'm babbling, but I'm kind of thinking about it. So yeah.
Well, it's really difficult because it's the confusion that's built into the system.
Yeah.
We're using which is Ali's point about maybe this is what philosophers do. This is what we get paid to do, is make these distinctions and then come up with new terms or reappropriate old terms in order to clarify what it is we're saying. Exactly, because humans, and again, as I started my first comment with, ambiguity for animal systems is not a bug, it's a feature. And it's like the blind man and the elephant, where you need the different perspectives, you need the different perspectives, you need the disparation, you need the disagreement, you need the argument in order to advance upon our understanding of what is, and as we get more understanding, we push the horizon of our umwelt of what it is we're aware of, and then that complicates the system even more, and it's this feedback cycle it's very confusing because it's constantly a moving target, and even having this conversation will expand our thoughts, and then we have to do it again. There's no end to it.
Yeah, it's like when you start, what they always say, when you think you start your PhD, you know stuff, and then you're done with your PhD and you just know, you realize you know very little about something, and you feel like you know less or something. That reminds me of that.
Yeah,
Opposed to more.
A PhD is it pretty much cures the Dunning-Kruger effect. Whatever Dunning-Kruger effect you had is cured.
Yeah, that's true.
At the same time, there's a sacred goal behind AI since the times immemorial, but like, when it gets linked back to Leibniz and what he built. So I think Leibniz, if I remember correctly, then Leibniz is like the whole point of why he wanted to build a machine that would solve problems was that then philosophers wouldn't have to argue anymore with each other. So like like sacred goal is sort of like to eliminate this ambiguity from everything, but yeah, then semioticians show up and say that, yeah, but stop, that's the whole what life is about, right?
Well, that's great, Ali, that I'm glad you brought that up, because it's always in the back of my mind, which turns it into a political discussion for better for worse, that searching for the sacred sort of answer is intrinsic to all our systems, whether it's religion or capitalism or a monarchy, philosophy. The Philosopher's Stone is essentially like one answer. The everlasting life, utopia. All these different human desires, like deep traumatic desires to stem the doubt, stem the questioning, stem our nature. And but arguably that's why humanity finds itself in the situation it finds itself, whatever your opinion of our precarious state, is exactly because we've had all these systems that have been very adept at coming ever so close to finding the one answer, only to realize that was only that it undermines itself. It just always does, and it always will. There's no one answer. So so what do you do with that? Like, is communication in that? So I'd put communication in that context. Like, if we accept that it's this never-ending effort, and that there is no one answer, there is no utopia, then communication, the goal of a good communication, a healthy communication, becomes a bit kind of maybe to Lavinia's earlier point, becomes a completely different task all of a sudden.
Etta has raised her hand, so I would actually give her for the last question, and then we have to wrap up. We're running out of time.
I don't know whether it's a question or
Comment.
rather a comment. I can't even switch on my camera. Because I was thinking about computer languages being extremely efficient. I think they're efficient if you have a limited task to fulfill. And if I think about the same situation with human beings, like if there is a team fulfilling a specific limited repetitive task, they could become very efficient in their task-oriented communication, like using not full verbal sentences, but only some utterances and sounds and movements to communicate very efficiently. So I'm not so sure about programming language being very more efficient than human communication, even in fulfilling limited repetitive tasks.
I would say that it's so when you have a team working and you have to coordinate their actions, then it's already post the programming phase where you first defined how they have to interact and whatnot. But also there, you usually still have ambiguities, like how far would one person reach the hand and whatnot. So for then the reason I picked up the computer language is efficiency or precision, maybe would be the better word, is that it's more precise for me to define in a, let's say, few hundred line program what the computer need to do to perform a task, then I would have to go through with a team where I have to quite probably go over multiple training operations and so forth. So the process of training that team would be much less efficient than defining the well-versed program for the computer, while me knowing exactly what the computer will do, and there will be no ambiguity how the computer will then behave to the instruction that it's been given to. But I agree that they're coming back to the definition, what is communication, and how the messages are being transferred from one person to the other. So I think it goes deeper to what Auli meant is the overall course of this task, this series of meetings.
It kind of illustrates actually a lot of motivation behind current AI development also, I think, as to the optimization, or like how to make things more easy, but it entails the mechanization of people in a way, and so this is more easy to do with code than with actual people, probably. So yeah, kind of get that. Therese, do you have any last comments or thoughts, questions?
I want to say thank you to all of you and for the really insightful discussion. So thank you a lot. I mean, Josh, I will think about this ambiguity aspect you mentioned. I will definitely look into that. I thought that was very interesting. I really enjoyed the discussion. Thank you so much for the feedback and helping me with my thinking. That's what I was hoping would happen. And it did happen. And thank you, Auli, for having me in this nice seminar. And I will definitely join for the next talk and discussions. So yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And yeah, I feel like the question about what is communication is not resolved, but we need ambiguity. So I'll think about it further. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you. And so next time we'll meet on July 10th with Alec. Alec, do you maybe want to say a couple of words about your presentation that you're going to talk about, or?
Sure. Yeah, it is a case study, well, more so a reflection on the current state of how we have integrated AI into the semiosphere in different applications. So not so much about one specific culture, but looking at different examples of how AI is becoming a part of a semiosphere and what happens to the boundary and the center and so on. So I'll look at the theory, but emphasize more about the examples of the real life situations.
Yep, thanks. Okay, yeah, I still need to update the event page, but yeah, basically same time, same link, essentially, Zoom. So see you in 3 weeks, and thank you, everyone. I will end the recording now.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you, Therese. Have a great day. Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye.
Thank you.